There's been a recent second boom of GameCube-style controllers coming to the Nintendo Switch, and one of the ones that's really been turning the most heads, and I've just been seeing a lot of people grab immediately as long as stock is available, is the NYXI Wizard. The demand for this is so high, in fact, that I actually missed the original window for ordering one on time. In fact, this one isn't even mine. That's coming at the end of this month. This one I was able to get my hands on thanks to a friend of a friend. You might have seen recently I did a video with Shank Mods, and a buddy of his, Rocker Gaming, was able to send this over for us to try out. So real quick, shout out to him. It was awesome to have in that video, and I want to do some more in-depth thoughts on it now that I've had a little time to mess with it. Now, the basic premise here is that this is trying to capitalize on that dream of GameCube-style Joy Cons. These are individual wireless controllers that the Switch does read as Joy Cons when you attach them to the system. When you sync them up afterwards, the system just registers them as regular gray Joy Cons. So they can be used independently, and if you wanted to for whatever reason, you could even use them sideways, as awkward as that is. Using them individually sideways aside, the three main ways you can really use this are, of course, having it directly attached to the Switch so you can use them in handheld mode, using them with this little combiner right here so you can use it like a regular wireless controller when the Switch is docked or in tabletop mode, or also, surprisingly a little more viable than I thought it would be, you can actually use these just individually, one in each hand, like you could with Joy-Cons wirelessly. It's not necessarily the best way to do it, but it actually kind of works. Now, the other thing about this is that this is not an officially licensed controller, and it's actually quite expensive for not being one. Normally, when you look at unlicensed options, you're usually seeing a pretty healthy price difference where it's, more noticeably cheaper than first party or officially licensed options. This is an $80 controller, so this costs just as much as buying an official pair of Joy-Cons. Of course, it's also capitalizing on a slightly more unique market of being a GameCube-style Joy-Con that does host a number of other additional special features. So let's talk about how well it actually does that and if it's worth that price point. First off, let's talk about that GameCube style design as well as just button and stick feel. Generally speaking, this is a little bit closer to the Wavebird style controller in terms of just where the weight distribution is at and the general shape of the controller. The handles are a little thinner on the outside, though you still have this kind of thicker body going on in the middle, and the general placement of where these sticks and buttons are relative to each other is about the same, aside from obviously having some extra buttons to account for the fact that this is meant for the Switch and not actually to be used with the GameCube. Now, while the grip is similar, there's a lot of pretty big differences in terms of how this feels across the board. Some of these are choices to take into account that, again, this is for the Switch and not for the GameCube, but also just a few choices are made here to really make it its own differentiated standout controller. For instance, the D-pad on it is larger, which is one of the few things about the original GameCube controller that I do like having changed. I like the larger size, though it has also opted for a slightly clickier design. It's not a full click like using the directional buttons on official Joy-Cons. It kind of has a bit of a softness to it, but there is a very clear clicky register for each of the 4 directions on the D-pad. The same also applies to the shoulder buttons on this controller. It has, of course, the front R and L buttons along with the ZL and ZR, and all 4 of these are clicky. So you're not getting that full analog pull like a GameCube style controller offers because, again, this is a Switch controller and pretty much no games take advantage of analog pull like that. Just a couple that are specifically meant to invoke a GameCube controller, like, say, in the Mario collection. But these are very light mouse click style buttons on all 4 of these. In terms of the ABXY buttons, they are a kind of soft touch style. They don't have the clicky register the shoulder buttons or D-pad have. Compared to the GameCube controller and even to the official Switch Pro controller, there is just what feels like a little bit of extra stiffness to them. The amount of pressure needed to press down, the travel distance on it, there's just a little bit of stiffness to it that makes it a bit harder, I think, for really rapid presses. I think my general takeaway here is that it does not feel as good as some first-party options or some other expensive Pro controllers out there, but certainly not the worst I've used by far. Now, the sticks are an interesting point on this because it's actually one of the special features this controller offers. The gates around these sticks are actually swappable. By default, you have this octagon-shaped gate that is reminiscent of the official GameCube controller. That way, you really feel and know when you're pressing each specific direction, including the diagonal. This is really handy for those games where being able to precisely put the stick in one of the 8 directions is really nice. If you'd prefer the more traditional circle-style gate, especially if you're playing a game where you're doing a lot of rolling inputs, this does come with a circle-style approach as well that you can swap swap in and out. The mechanism for doing so feels a little awkward. You basically have to just kind of rip the stick out after turning the gate a certain way, but once you've done it a couple times, you get the feeling down pretty good. In addition to all these buttons, we of course have the plus and minuses right here, along with the home and capture buttons. There's also this additional setting button right here, which is used for on-the-fly mapping with the buttons on the back. These are remappable buttons. Because each controller is technically its own individual unit, you do have to map the back button to something that is on the same controller, so that does lightly limit some of the options. For instance, if you wanted to have both A and B be mapped to different buttons, you can't do that. You can map one of them to the one over here, and in this one, you're going to have to pick something that's on the left side of the controller. I will say for the back buttons, I'm sometimes worried when you have ones that you are somewhat unavoidably having to put your hands on, where you're just going to naturally grip your fingers around them. Even if you do a 4-button setup, that ends up raising your ring fingers up a little bit to still sit on them. However, the amount of force necessary to actually press down on this is significant enough that I never really find myself accidentally clicking these. That's usually the fear when you have ones that you're resting fingers on, but you really need to go out of your way to press down on these to make it register. Accidental misclicks is not a thing that I've experienced with this. Speaking of pushing buttons to make them register, this is not necessarily a super important make or break thing, but it is kind of annoying. I don't love the buttons for taking the Joy Cons on and off rails. It just feels like you're pressing down enough, and then you may not actually be. You really need to make sure you get your finger in there to press down and apply a healthy amount of pressure. And even then, there's just a little bit of extra fight you're gonna get from either the switch rails themselves or from this middle piece attachment. It just has an awkward amount of pressure applied that I haven't really experienced with either official Joy-Cons or any other kind of slide rail mechanics out there that I've used. Overall, I'm actually pretty happy with the way this controller came out. It does feel a little bit on the expensive side for what you are getting, but if your goal is a GameCube style controller that you want to be able to use on the Switch tablet itself in handheld mode, this is one of the better solutions I have used. Again, I do wish that you actually had the more kind of analog trigger design. Even though it doesn't apply to a lot of Switch games, it just feels right for the GameCube style layout in my opinion. And the ABXY buttons, while not the worst I've used, I just feel like they could be a little bit better. It is one of the things that does hold it back a bit. Stick tension also feels a little bit lower than I would personally like, but I think that is a bit of a preference thing. I like to have sticks that fight back just a little bit, and I can really feel them satisfyingly snap back into place. These ones just have a little bit of looseness to them that I don't like quite as much. If your goal is a GameCube style controller primarily for docked gameplay, for instance, you want to do Smash Brothers, OEM is still going to be the best way to go. But if your goal is something that gets close, is usable across more Switch titles, and most importantly, can actually be used with the system in handheld mode on the go, and not something where you have to do a wireless tabletop setup, this is honestly a really solid solution. If you're interested in grabbing one of these, I do have a link posted down below in the description. As I mentioned earlier in this video, this is kind of a follow-up to another larger GameCube style controller video I did with Shank Mods to celebrate basically the anniversary of when he did the GameCube Joy Cons first a few years back. So make sure to check out that video if you haven't seen it yet. As always, if you enjoyed this one, hit the thumbs up button to let me know, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I will see you guys later.